He goes quiet, and your mind starts running through every worst-case scenario you can imagine. No text, no call, nothing. Just silence sitting in your phone like a weight in your chest. You start replaying the last conversation, searching for the exact word or sentence that might have pushed him away. You check if he's been online. You wonder if he's talking to someone else. You wonder if you said too much or not enough, or if you're simply too much for someone to handle. But here's something almost nobody tells you, something that goes against everything your anxious mind is screaming right now. Silence is not always rejection. Sometimes silence is the loudest sign that something real is happening underneath the surface. Sometimes the very moment he pulls away is the moment his feelings are becoming too big for him to process out loud. Stay with me for the next few minutes, because what you're about to hear will change the way you look at every quiet moment, every unanswered message, every distant mood you've ever experienced in a relationship. This isn't about giving him excuses. This is about understanding what's really happening in the human mind when love starts to feel like too much to hold. Let's start with something most people never think about. Human beings are not built to handle emotional intensity the same way. Some people feel a rush of closeness and they run toward it, wrapping themselves in it, wanting more of it every single day. Other people feel that same rush of closeness and their nervous system reacts like it just touched fire. It's not that the feeling isn't real, it's that the feeling is too real, too fast, too big for a mind that was never taught how to sit inside intimacy without flinching. When a person starts falling for someone deeply, their brain doesn't always respond with excitement. Sometimes it responds with alarm, because falling in love means losing control. It means opening a door that could just as easily be slammed shut by someone else. And for a lot of people, especially those who learned early in life that closeness leads to pain, that door feels more like a threat than a gift. Think about it from a purely psychological standpoint. Attachment doesn't develop in adulthood. It develops in childhood, long before a person even understands what love is supposed to look like. If someone grew up in a home where affection was inconsistent, where love had to be earned, where emotional needs were dismissed or mocked, their nervous system learns a very specific lesson. Closeness is dangerous. Even if that person desperately wants love as an adult, their body still remembers the old pattern. So when real intimacy starts to form, when someone finally makes them feel safe enough to actually care, their nervous system doesn't celebrate. It panics. And that panic doesn't always look like panic from the outside. Sometimes it looks like silence. Sometimes it looks like distance. Sometimes it looks exactly like what you're experiencing right now, and it feels personal, but it isn't about you at all. It's about a pattern that was built long before you ever entered the picture. Now, here's where it gets even more interesting, and this is something psychologists call a deactivating strategy. When someone with an avoidant attachment style starts feeling too close to another person, their mind automatically searches for ways to create space. Not because they don't care, but because closeness is triggering old wounds they don't even consciously remember. So they start pulling back right when things start feeling good. They go quiet right after a deep conversation. They create distance right after a moment of vulnerability. It feels backwards, almost cruel, but it's actually a defense mechanism kicking in exactly the way it was trained to. Their heart wants to move forward, but their nervous system is slamming on the brakes because deep down, some part of them believes that getting close to someone always ends the same way, with loss, with disappointment, with pain they don't want to feel again. And here's the part that most people miss completely. The intensity of the withdrawal is often directly connected to the intensity of the feelings. Someone who doesn't care barely notices you exist. They don't overthink conversations. They don't need space after getting close. They simply drift away because there was never enough investment to hold on to in the first place. But someone who is falling hard, someone who feels something real and terrifying and unfamiliar, that person often pulls back the most. Because the stakes feel higher. Because losing you would actually hurt. Because for the first time in a long time, or maybe for the first time ever, they're scared of how much they want this to work. I want you to sit with that for a second because it matters more than you think. Fear of loss doesn't exist without attachment. You don't fear losing something you never valued. If someone pulls away after getting close to you, ask yourself honestly, is this someone who never cared? Or is this someone who is terrified of how much they do? Now hold on to that thought, because in a few minutes I'm going to show you the exact moment where withdrawal shifts from fear into something far more telling. A moment most people scroll right past without ever realizing what it actually means. But before we get there, we need to talk about what's happening inside your own mind while all of this unfolds. Because understanding him is only half the story. Understanding yourself is where the real power lies. When someone you care about goes quiet, your brain doesn't process it calmly. It processes it as a threat. This is not weakness, this is biology. Human beings are wired for connection, and when connection feels uncertain, the brain reacts almost the same way it would react to physical danger. Your heart rate increases. Your thoughts start racing. You start searching for answers, for patterns, for anything that will bring back a sense of control. This is why silence from someone you love can feel unbearable, even if logically you know it might mean nothing serious. Your nervous system doesn't care about logic in that moment. It cares about survival. It wants information. It wants reassurance. And when it doesn't get either, it fills the gap with fear. This is exactly why people spiral during silence. Not because they're irrational, but because uncertainty is one of the most uncomfortable states a human mind can sit in. We would almost rather receive bad news than sit in not knowing. At least bad news gives us something to process. Silence gives us nothing but our own imagination, and our imagination, especially when it's fueled by fear, almost always creates the worst possible story. But here's something worth remembering. The story your mind creates during silence is not automatically the truth. It's a survival mechanism trying to protect you from getting hurt again, whether by preparing you for the worst or by pushing you to seek reassurance. Recognizing this doesn't mean ignoring your feelings. It means understanding where they're coming from so you can respond with clarity instead of panic. Let's go deeper into what's actually happening on his side when distance shows up right after closeness. Picture this. Two people are talking, laughing, connecting in a way that feels effortless. There's a moment of real vulnerability. Maybe he shares something personal, maybe you do, maybe there's a silence between you that feels comfortable instead of awkward. And then almost overnight, everything shifts. Replies become shorter. Conversations become less frequent. He seems distracted, distant, somewhere else, even when he's right there. From the outside, it looks like he's losing interest. But psychologically, this pattern often shows the opposite. It shows that something real touched a nerve, and instead of knowing how to sit inside that feeling, his mind reacted the only way it knows how, by creating distance to regain a sense of control. This is where the cliffhanger comes in, the part I promised you earlier. There is one specific behavior that separates someone who is truly losing interest from someone who is falling deeper but retreating out of fear, and it has nothing to do with how often he texts. It has to do with what he does in the moments he thinks you're not paying attention. I'll walk you through exactly what that looks like in a few minutes, because once you see it, you won't be able to unsee it in your own situation. For now, let's talk about why this pattern repeats itself so often in people who are emotionally avoidant. Avoidance isn't a personality flaw. It's a coping mechanism built from real experiences, real disappointments, real moments where opening up led to getting hurt. Someone who learned early that vulnerability equals danger will instinctively protect themselves from anything that feels like real intimacy, even when part of them desperately wants it. This creates an internal conflict that most avoidant people don't even fully understand themselves. They want closeness, but closeness feels unsafe. They want to be known, but being known feels exposing. So they oscillate. They move close, then they retreat. They open up, then they shut down. Not because they're playing games, but because they're genuinely caught between desire and fear, and most of the time, they don't have the language to explain it even to themselves. This is why people with avoidant patterns often seem confusing to the people who love them. One week, they're fully present, engaged, affectionate. The next week, they're distant, quiet, hard to reach. It's not manipulation, It's not always even conscious. It's a nervous system trying to regulate an emotional experience that feels bigger than it knows how to handle. Now, does this mean you should wait forever for someone who keeps pulling away? Absolutely not. Understanding someone's psychology doesn't mean excusing behavior that leaves you constantly anxious or unseen. There's a difference between someone who is working through fear while still showing up in meaningful ways and someone who uses distance as a permanent excuse to avoid accountability. One shows growth over time. The other repeats the same cycle indefinitely, leaving you to do all the emotional labor while they stay safely out of reach. Recognizing the psychological pattern isn't about giving someone a free pass. It's about giving yourself clarity so you can decide what you're actually willing to accept. Let's talk about something people rarely discuss when it comes to emotional withdrawal, and that's the physical experience of falling for someone when you're not used to feeling safe. For someone with a more avoidant attachment style, deep emotional connection doesn't just feel emotionally intense, it feels physically overwhelming. Their chest tightens, their mind races, their instinct is to create space just to breathe. This isn't dramatic exaggeration, it's a documented physiological response tied to how the nervous system processes closeness after early experiences of emotional inconsistency. When someone finally starts to feel truly close to another person, especially after years of keeping people at a safe distance, that closeness can trigger a stress response almost identical to danger. The body doesn't always know the difference between falling in love and losing control. To a nervous system trained on self-protection, both feel remarkably similar. This is why some of the most emotionally significant relationships in someone's life come with the most confusing patterns of push and pull. The intensity of the connection is often mirrored by the intensity of the retreat. It's almost paradoxical. The deeper the feeling, the stronger the instinct to create distance from it. Which brings us back to something worth repeating because it's easy to forget in the middle of hurt and confusion, distance is not always the absence of feeling. Sometimes distance is feeling amplified beyond what someone knows how to express. Let's bring this back to you for a moment because your emotional experience matters just as much in this story. If you've ever found yourself checking your phone obsessively, rereading old messages, analyzing tone, searching for hidden meaning behind a delayed reply, you are not overreacting. You are a person who cares, trying to make sense of uncertainty using the only tools available to you. But here's something important to understand. Constantly chasing clarity during someone else's withdrawal often deepens the very cycle you're trying to escape. When someone pulls away and you respond by pursuing harder, sending more messages, seeking more reassurance, you can unintentionally reinforce their instinct to create even more distance. Because now closeness doesn't just feel intense, it feels like pressure. This isn't about blaming yourself for wanting connection. It's about recognizing a dynamic that, once understood, can completely change how you respond. The most powerful thing you can do in moments of silence is not to disappear completely, but to regulate yourself instead of chasing regulation from someone else. This means allowing yourself to feel the discomfort of uncertainty without immediately trying to fix it through action. It means trusting that your worth isn't determined by how quickly someone responds to a message. It means giving both yourself and the other person room to process, instead of turning every quiet moment into a crisis that needs immediate resolution. Now, back to that behavior I promised to reveal. The one thing that separates fading interest from fear-driven retreat. Pay close attention here, because this is the part most people never notice until they're taught to look for it. Someone who is truly losing interest tends to disengage completely, even in the small moments. They stop initiating anything. They stop remembering small details you've shared. Their curiosity about your life fades along with their communication. But someone who is pulling away out of fear, someone who is falling deeper than they know how to admit, often continues to show up in quiet, almost invisible ways. They might not text as often, but they remember something you mentioned weeks ago. They might seem distant in conversation, but they show up when it actually matters. They might go quiet for days, but the moment something significant happens in your life, they're the first to reach out. This is the psychological fingerprint of someone who cares, but is scared, rather than someone who simply doesn't care at all. Genuine disinterest is consistent. Fear-based withdrawal is inconsistent, filled with moments of retreat, followed by moments of unexpected presence, almost like someone testing how safe it is to come closer again. This pattern can be incredibly confusing to experience because it doesn't offer the clean, clear signal most people are searching for. It would be so much easier if someone who cared simply acted consistently caring, and someone who didn't simply disappeared for good. But human emotions rarely follow a straight line, especially for people still learning how to tolerate closeness without running from it. So what do you do with all of this information? First, understand that awareness is not the same as tolerance. You can understand exactly why someone pulls away and still decide that you deserve consistency rather than confusion. Compassion for someone's psychological patterns doesn't mean abandoning your own emotional needs. You are allowed to want clarity. You are allowed to want steady communication. You are allowed to want someone who chooses to work through their fear instead of using it as a permanent shield against accountability. Second, pay attention to effort over time, not just words in a single moment. Someone who is falling deeper but scared will often show small signs of growth, even if slow. They might apologize for going quiet. They might explain, even briefly, that they needed space to process rather than pretending nothing happened. They might return with more presence than before, almost like they're trying to make up for the distance without fully explaining why it happened. These small moments of effort matter more than grand gestures because they show self-awareness, and self-awareness is often the first sign that someone is capable of real emotional growth. Third, protect your own peace while this unfolds. You are not responsible for fixing someone else's fear of intimacy. You can be patient, you can be understanding, but you cannot force someone to feel safe before they're ready. If you find yourself constantly shrinking, apologizing, or performing to keep someone from pulling away, that's not patience anymore. That's self-abandonment disguised as love. Real connection should never require you to disappear in order to keep someone close. Let's talk for a moment about why this entire topic resonates so deeply with so many people. Almost everyone has experienced some version of this story. A person who seemed completely present suddenly became distant. A conversation that felt deeply connecting was followed by silence that felt impossible to explain. A relationship that seemed to be moving forward suddenly stalled, leaving confusion where clarity used to be. This isn't a rare experience. It's one of the most common emotional patterns in human connection, precisely because so many people carry unresolved fears around intimacy, whether they realize it or not. Understanding this pattern doesn't just help you make sense of someone else's behavior, it helps you make sense of your own. Maybe you've been the one pulling away in past relationships, creating distance the moment things started feeling too real. Maybe you recognize this fear in yourself just as clearly as you recognize it in someone else. If so, this understanding becomes even more powerful, because it stops being about analyzing another person's behavior and starts becoming a mirror for your own emotional patterns. Healing this pattern, whether in yourself or in understanding someone else, doesn't happen through overanalyzing every message or every silence. It happens through consistent safety over time. It happens when someone experiences closeness that doesn't lead to punishment, rejection, or engulfment. Slowly, repeatedly, the nervous system starts to learn a new lesson: this person is safe. This closeness won't destroy me. I don't have to run every time things start to feel real, but that kind of healing takes time, patience, and mutual effort. It cannot be rushed through pressure or forced through pursuit. And it absolutely cannot happen if one person is doing all the emotional work while the other remains completely closed off, never acknowledging the pattern, never making an effort to grow. This is why self-awareness matters so much on both sides. If you're the one experiencing someone else's withdrawal, awareness helps you respond with grounded clarity instead of anxious pursuit. If you're the one who tends to withdraw when things get real, awareness gives you the chance to catch yourself in the pattern, to communicate even a small piece of what's happening internally instead of disappearing completely. Something as simple as saying, "I need a little space to process, but this isn't about losing interest," can completely change the emotional experience for both people involved. Silence without explanation breeds fear. Silence with even a small amount of context, even something brief and imperfect, creates a completely different emotional experience. It shows that even in withdrawal, there is still consideration for the other person's feelings. This small shift, choosing minimal communication over complete disappearance, is often the difference between a relationship that survives emotional avoidance and one that slowly erodes under the weight of unexplained distance. Now let's bring this conversation back to the deeper truth sitting underneath everything we've discussed. Love, real love, is rarely simple. It doesn't always look like constant closeness and effortless communication. Sometimes it looks messy. Sometimes it looks like two people learning how to trust something that feels unfamiliar. Sometimes it looks like silence that isn't rejection, but fear wearing rejection's mask. This doesn't mean every silence should be excused. It doesn't mean every distant moment deserves patience. But it does mean that before assuming the worst, it's worth asking a deeper question. Is this someone who never cared? Or is this someone whose feelings became so real that their instinct was to protect themselves from the very thing they wanted most? Understanding this doesn't just change how you interpret someone else's behavior, it changes how you show up in your own relationships. It teaches you to communicate instead of assume. It teaches you to ask instead of spiral. It teaches you to give space without abandoning yourself in the process. And most importantly, it teaches you that emotional withdrawal, while painful to experience, is often far more complicated than a simple lack of interest. If you've made it this far, I want you to think honestly about your own experience. Has there been a moment in your life where someone pulled away right after getting close to you? And looking back now, do you think it was because they didn't care or because they cared more than they knew how to handle? I want you to sit with that question because your answer might reveal something you've never fully allowed yourself to consider. Before we finish, let's talk about one more layer to this, something that often gets overlooked entirely. Not every retreat is rooted in fear of intimacy, specifically tied to that one relationship. Sometimes withdrawal is connected to unresolved patterns from past relationships that have nothing to do with you directly, but everything to do with how someone learned to protect themselves after being hurt before. If someone experienced betrayal, abandonment, or emotional neglect in a previous relationship, their nervous system carries that history into every new connection, even when they consciously want things to be different this time. This is why someone can genuinely want a relationship to succeed and still sabotage closeness without fully understanding why. Old wounds don't announce themselves. They show up quietly, disguised as distance, disguised as hesitation, disguised as sudden silence after moments of real connection. This is important to understand because it removes the assumption that withdrawal is always a direct reflection of how someone feels about you specifically. Sometimes it is, but often it's a reflection of unhealed history colliding with a present moment that feels too vulnerable to fully embrace. Recognizing this distinction can completely change how you interpret someone's behavior, not by excusing it, but by understanding it with more nuance than a simple story of losing interest. At the same time, this understanding comes with an important boundary. Recognizing someone's psychological wounds is not the same as carrying the responsibility to heal them. You can hold compassion for someone's past while still requiring emotional consistency in your present. You can understand exactly why someone struggles with closeness and still choose not to stay in a dynamic that leaves you feeling perpetually uncertain. Compassion and boundaries are not opposites. In fact, real compassion often requires boundaries, because without them, understanding someone's pain can quietly turn into excusing behavior that continues to hurt you. As we come to the end of this, I want to leave you with something worth carrying forward. Silence is complicated. Distance is complicated. Human emotion, especially the kind tied to fear of intimacy, rarely follows a simple, predictable pattern. But within that complexity, there is one thing worth remembering. People who truly don't care disappear completely, without hesitation, without lingering thoughts, without quiet moments of reappearing when it matters most. People who care deeply but are afraid often show up in smaller, quieter, more inconsistent ways. Not because they don't feel something real, but because they're still learning how to sit inside that feeling without running from it. Understanding this doesn't mean waiting indefinitely for someone to figure themselves out. It means giving yourself the clarity to recognize genuine effort, however imperfect, versus complete emotional absence. It means protecting your own peace while allowing space for growth without abandoning your own needs in the process. And most importantly, it means recognizing that love, real love, often requires both people to face their fears, not just one person carrying the emotional weight alone. So here's my question for you, and I genuinely want you to answer this in the comments. Have you ever experienced someone pulling away right after getting emotionally close to you, and looking back, do you believe it was fear, or was it simply a lack of real feeling? I want to hear your story, because somewhere in this comment section, someone else is going through exactly what you've been through, and your experience might be the exact thing they need to read today.